Welcome to the Lindsay Years Symposium. This is a symposium in which we're exploring the innovations and changes that were made during the years that John Lindsay was mayor of the city of New York, from 1966 to 1973, and the challenges and efforts that he undertook in order to make New York a livable city in a time that was quite tumultuous in the New York and the national history. I want to welcome you to this program and to join the program that's in progress. The next panel's focus is around one other large set of initiatives that the mayor had, which was really to begin to bring services closer to the communities, and to the extent to which that really engaged the communities in the dialogue over what the quality of services that were getting delivered is part of what we're going to explore this morning. But out of that whole effort of command decentralization, eventually in 1975, the charter actually created Coterminus Districts, the idea being that community board boundaries would align even slightly and perfectly with service districts of several of the city agencies. I have to say, reading self-written bios, that can be very funny. So anyway, I'm going to read what people wrote. So Lou Feldstein, who was involved in this whole effort during those days, is currently the president of New Hampshire Charitable Foundation, the principal source of venture capital for state's nonprofit community. Mr. Feldstein worked with the civil rights movement in Mississippi and served for 7 years in senior staff positions of New York City Mayor John Lindsay. His singular achievements include a 7-year tenure as the MC of the International Zucchini Festival and a stint as wine steward and personal assistant to movie legend John Wayne aboard Wayne's yacht in the Mediterranean. Now, stop there. I am going to stop there. I mean, we could have a whole discussion about what it meant to be John Wayne's personal assistant. To Lou's left is Joe Viteritti, and I met Joe when Joe was a graduate student in the Graduate Center, studying some of the innovations that I think took place in the uniformed services. Right. Joe is the Blanche D. Blank Professor of Public Policy and Chair of the Department of Urban Affairs and Planning at Hunter. And he's been there since 2004. Prior to that, he taught at Princeton, NYU, Harvard, and at SUNY Albany. Professor Viteritti specializes in education policy, state and local governance, and public law. Joe has an extensive record of public service. He is presently on the steering committee of the National Campaign for Civil Education in Schools. He was recently executive director of the Commission on School Governance appointed by the New York City public advocate when Betsy was the New York City advocate. He's been a special assistant to the Chancellor of Schools when Frank Mayoral was Chancellor, and a senior advisor to the superintendents of schools in Boston and San Francisco. And he was recently, I think, the research director of the Charter Commission for Mayor Blumberg that Chancellor Matt Goldstein chaired. To his left is Craig Hammerman, who is, in fact, I guess his position was created as a result of this, is the district manager of Brooklyn Community Board 6 since February of 1993. Wow. He and his team ensure the effective and efficient delivery of municipal services by engaging, coordinating, and successfully advocating for resources necessary to serve his district. Craig's leadership is best known in the area of information technology and its application at the local levels of government. He's regularly consulted by top administrative officials on administrative, fiscal, and municipal service management issues and policies. He spearheaded the effort of community boards to access the various city government agency complaint systems and databases that ultimately laid the foundation for the emerging and now in place successfully 311 system. And with that, I'd like to turn the mic over to Lou Feldstein, John Wayne's right arm. There you go.
Pilgrim. Okay, two stories I want to start with because I want to somehow get us out of this sedate, august room and remind you what it felt like in the late 60s and early 70s, so you can appreciate, if that's the word, what we were trying to do. Sometimes all the retrospection and the distance loses some of the the juice. First story comes from Bob Schrank. Some of you know Bob Schrank was the number 2 guy in the city's manpower agency, a red diaper baby, first communist I ever met. Schrank tells me the story that he gets a call one day from John Lindsay. Bob happened to be close to the mayor for odd reasons, and Lindsay says, "We got a problem. 1,000 neighborhood youth corps kids are right now occupying the federal building." Schrank says, So what am I going to do about it, says Lindsay. Schrank says, "Nothing. It's a federal building. Let them worry about it." "I can't let them worry about it," says Lindsay. "I got the press on my back. I got the cops on my back wanting to know what to do about it. And I got Willard Wirtz, the Secretary of Labor, calling me saying, 'What are you going to do about this?'" Schrank says, "Relax, relax. They'll get bored. They'll leave." So he manages to calm the mayor down. And apparently, Willard Wirtz is not satisfied. So on his own, Willard Wirtz calls up the federal building, demands to speak to one of these kids there, ends up talking to one of the ringleaders. And the kid says, "Who this?" He says, "This is Willard Wirtz." Willard Wirtz is sort of a stuffy, self-important man as Secretary of Labor. "Who are you?" "I am the Secretary of Labor." Kid says, "I talk to no mother secretaries." Click. Hangs up the phone. Willard Wirtz is furious. He calls Lindsay, tells Lindsay the story, says, "I want that young man to apologize to me. And I want to know what your schools are doing. I want a course in civic education for every one of the kids in that building. They should know who the Secretary of Labor is." Lesson number 1. So a day later, I'm in the city. I tell the story, this is the last of these stories, to a friend who's a senior partner in one of the city's major law firms, but at the time was an urban fellow and was assigned to me. He was at Yale Law. And he tells me, he said, "That's a funny story. Do you remember 1 month after I came to work for you as an urban fellow, you gave me an assignment one time. You said, I want you to go sit in on a Council Against Poverty meeting." That used to be part of my responsibilities. He said, "What am I going to do?" "Just go, sit in, you're going to learn something." Jack is laughing already. He can see things like this. So he goes to sit in. And he says, "What do I do there?" "Just learn, observe." Anything else? If things get tense, you do whatever Major Owens does. Just keep your eye on Major Owens, who is the city's commissioner dealing with a lot of the anti-poverty groups. So he goes to the meeting. It's the summer. He says it was hot as hell, noisy, people yelling and screaming. He said, I couldn't figure out what was going on. And suddenly there's this huge burst of noise down the hall. And we realize there's some big demonstration that's broken into the building, and we hear them coming down the hall towards us. Cops jump up, close the doors, stand back to the doors like this, and the meeting goes on. And people are banging against the doors like that, and the doors are starting to shake, and suddenly the cops get pushed. And I'm looking and I say, holy shit, what do I do? And then he looks, Feldstein said, watch Major Owens. I look, Major Owens gets up, runs to the back of the building, opens the window, and jumps out the window. So this guy who was my urban fellow, in his blue suit, his white shirt, he's, oh God. So he runs, and he jumps out the window. Welcome to New York City, 1960s, right? Okay, so that's prologue to what we're going to talk about here. I want to read from a little Bible called Neighborhood Services, which is one of several books written about the project that we're talking about today. And these are actual little anecdotes that will help set the scene. First, next to a playground in the Bronx, trash blows around the streets for days because following standard operating procedures, the park's maintenance crew left the trash to be picked up by the Sanitation Department. But the local parks foreman had never met or talked with the Sanitation District, who works in the same district. Incident number 2. A traffic department engineer in central Brooklyn gets a call about cars blocking the streets around a storefront drug program, but no one had ever told this traffic department guy that the storefront was opening up there. And the third story, which I particularly like, is the assistant general parks manager who's responsible for all of the North Bronx, or the eastern third of the Bronx, complains that they built a skating rink and a swimming pool in his district, and he can neither get the skating rink to freeze nor the pool to drain. Turns out there's a 64-step procedure for new projects coming online. They do not include checking with the frontline supervisors about it. Now, I don't think these are unusual. There's another dozen stories like that. This is the way the city operated. In response to that, we see a whole series of management reforms, which I'm going to categorize in a moment. But I want to remind you one more. This project starts in 1970-71 in Lindsay's second term. He wins re-election with a minority of the votes, comes into office at a period of huge distrust. Distrust about him, distrust about the ability of the city to deliver services, high dissatisfaction on the part of the public that anybody can deliver services. On the part of some people, they think the city's inefficient, ineffective. On the part of some people, they think it's racially inspired, that the city's only focusing on some neighborhoods, could care less about white ethnic groups and so forth. They don't believe the city cares about them. So Lindsay goes into the second administration, and we talk about it, they talk about it, I don't even know what the pronoun is here, as the years of the neighborhood. The city is going to show that it can deliver on the ground. In part, this is inspired by all the major management reforms we've heard about all day yesterday and part of today. It took 4 years to begin to move these things and put them into place. People inside the city say, we can actually start to deliver. We've got the horsepower, we've got the skill, we know how to do that. We can start making things happen. And in part, it means putting something out on the ground so people will see that we can actually deliver services and deliver them neighborhood by neighborhood. First effort is to try, we go through a year trying to think about, is there some kind of political decentralization, shifting power? Despite the school strike, we're still talking about that. Lots of interest in it, but a lot of heat, no agreement on how to make it happen. And instead, the city moves to a very different process called Command Decentralization. So this is a simple way to group the management reforms. Don't hold me to this taxonomy, especially in a group like this, but a big piece of the work that have been done and has gotten attention is the first set of management reforms include the recruitment work being done, the program planning work, the productivity controls, lots of work being done in the second. A lot of work in increased citizen participation from all the work in the anti-poverty program, model cities, neighborhood councils, some effort to co-locate municipal services in a single building as if somehow putting them under a single roof would make it all happen. And then a series of direct reaches to the neighborhood, going to neighborhood city halls, little mayors, urban action task force, somehow connecting City Hall directly with the neighborhoods. David Rogers, sitting over here, has written a lot about this. So if I leave something out, David, you can correct me on it. So these are the changes, some of the broad changes. I want to speak specifically about a set of changes that we introduced in the second administration that pick up on these. Here are the premises, nothing brilliant about these. First, that there are a lot of important gaps in city services that can be remedied without paying huge amounts of money. We're not talking about new services, but about changing the way the line agencies operate. We heard examples of that just recently from Bob from Jim Kagan and others talking about the health reforms. But it's true again and again. Some changes can be made internally. Second, the command decentralization work, which we're about to do, focus specifically on two kinds of gaps. Integration among different agencies, where you need 2 or 3 agencies to make something happen. And secondly, how do you take this system and make it respond to people at the front end? What's the best way to do that? And the particular response here was about pushing responsibility down to district managers, the creation of a new position. Craig embodies it, represents a whole bunch of talented people who do this work now. In preface to this, I want to harken back to 2 comments made yesterday. One was from Herb Elish, who you're going to hear from in a moment, talking about his work as a sanitation commissioner, where he talked about the importance of getting people to own the change. You can't do it just from the top. People, you had how many people in the department, Herb? Okay, how do you move it out? He can't do it from the commissioner's office. They have to own that change. That's one piece. Put differently, Carter Bales, talking about the program budgeting work and the management, talked about the need, as he described it, decentralization. We've got to move, progress is moving this into the agencies, out of the budget bureau, out of the mayor's office. Agencies have to own the change. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. One thing to say it, takes an incredibly skilled manager to do that. And this is about how we tried to do it. So here's the 8-part plan that was adopted in '71 as the decentralization program. First, select districts, and we'll see in a moment where they were. We ended up picking basically the community planning districts. We ended up knowing we had nothing like the capacity to do the entire city, so the experiment focused on 8 districts around the city, about 1 million people, 1/8 of the city or so. Second change was to somehow create coterminus district lines. Stan referred to that. How do you get park, sanitation, police, all the different agencies to have the same set of district lines so you can make changes among agencies and create cooperation? Not an easy task. Third, how do you push authority down to the frontline managers? Police had taken the lead in that with the work that ultimately led to CompStat and the pushing of responsibility into the hands of police precinct commanders. How do you do that with other agencies so that it doesn't have to go all the way up to the top? The men and women at the front end exercise authority. Fourth, create district cabinets. Local cabinets representing all the key line service chiefs serving each neighborhood. So on a monthly basis at least, these men and women come together. The learning we all had, to a surprise, was most of these service chiefs never met one another. They didn't know who their peers were. Fifth, appoint district managers. Craig is an example of one of those. These were district managers appointed by the mayor, significantly, no line authority. For them to move something, they had to be persuasive and skillful enough to get people to buy into ideas of working together. Sixth, the idea was originally to station budget and planning people out into the agency offices, create a management information system for each one, and finally, to create neighborhood budgets. Interestingly, in those first years, no discussion about land use, which became a big role and is now for the community districts, but was not then. So that was the original plan that was put in place, and which finally it began. It was organized in '72. We began doing it, so we only had a brief period of time to do it. We held a press conference to announce this whole thing. You'll enjoy this. Here's the picture of the crew. Great. It tells you something by the representation there as well. After all the strikes, all the trouble, who's sitting there at the announcement of this effort to move decentralized authority out to the agencies? John Delury, part of the press conference, head of the Sanitation Union. Pretty interesting signal as to what that meant. The other piece of this is the big press announcement, which we had planned for months to do, and some son of a bitch of a reporter managed to get the story a month early and broke the story, and look at him grinning, because when I walked in this morning, Ralph handed me a copy of that story, which he broke several weeks early, and when I called me, I said, "You can't do this. We've been working for months to announce this thing." What do you mean I can't do it? And no success at all, and he rubbed it in by bringing the press release in to show it to me today that he had the story first. But this was the announcement. I'm going to stop by saying this project of district managers, district cabinets, all the pieces I've described, went into place in 8 districts in the city. It was in existence only for 18 months. No time at all. Significantly, the 18 months was hardly enough time to do something, but we did have some results that are worth noting, and I'm going to use this as my transition to Craig. The most significant one was that a charter commission created by Governor Rockefeller to revise the charter of the city of New York, and here's the state creating a plan to revise the city's charter, chaired by Roy Goodman, ended up recommending in 1975 a series of charter revision changes that basically followed the changes in this program. The first 5 steps and number 8 are all part of what were adopted by 60% of the public voting on the charter reform. So it got traction. It was the right step. Now the question is, what's left? What does it mean? What does it look like now, 30 years later? What should we have thought about differently? And that's where we move on. I'm going to switch to Craig, who's probably the longest serving, or among the longest serving district, he doesn't look like it, district managers, and talk some about what the system, how the system works now.
Thank you, Lou. I should also add, by the way, that It wasn't written in my bio, but I did get my master's in public administration from Baruch in 1997. So it's nice to come home, although this building didn't exist back then, so it's nice to come to a new home. Thank you for inviting me. I'm really honored to be part of this panel and this discussion in general, because when Mayor Lindsay first took office in 1966, I was 1 year old, living in Brooklyn, and very proud of that. But I did not vote for him in either election. Can't claim to have. I may have been one of the babies he kissed, but that's my connection to Mayor Lindsay. But I do think of myself and the role that we play at the community boards as part of his living legacy. And the extension of the programs and the innovations that he had so brilliantly brought to city government has moved forward. I really love the opportunity to talk to some of the people that were around then and just ask, what the hell were you guys thinking when you came up with these structures? Because honestly, this was just such a radical notion that this major city of New York, which had been criticized as being ungovernable, unmanageable, Mayor Lindsay put science into the political science here in New York with a lot of his innovative approaches, and it's something that I think a lot of other municipalities took notice of and started to replicate for themselves. But I actually was asked to just sort of talk about some of my experiences as a district manager with the community board. I've actually been there since 1990, so I've been there for a little over 20 years. I started when I was 12. Actually, I was the youngest district manager in 1993 at the time when I was promoted, and I really think that my community board took a very big gamble on promoting me at the time. I had only been there for 3 years and really had no formal background in city government or political science. But it's really been a blessing. I look forward to going to work every single day, and not many people can say that after they've been in the same place for 20 years. And it's largely because the community boards, I believe, in order to be effective, community boards need to be timely and relevant to the communities that they serve, which means periodically and in an ongoing fashion, you need to consider the services that you provide and reinvent yourself, as it were. Right now, for example, one of the undertakings that we're looking at is how to incorporate more social media into the work that we do. Facebook and Twitter and all of these other devices that have been put out there have been rapidly adopted by the marketplace, and in order to continue to provide quality service, to reach our constituencies, really to be effective at what we do, we really can't let opportunities like that slip through our fingers and become archaic and obsolete, because then we would feed into the arguments that community boards are really just there to gum up the works, so we don't serve any vital purpose, we're not adding value to local government. So one of the hallmarks, I believe, of my tenure at the community board has been to always find ways to add value, to distinguish ourselves between what agencies do and what we do for our communities, to not duplicate services, and really to reinvent ourselves, as I said earlier, every few years. Keep up with the times, try and stay at least a half a step ahead of the game. So I have to say, though, that departing from Lou's framework, that the community boards, because they are actually non-mayoral agencies, really lack a lot of the connections to the city administration that would truly imbue us with a sense of respect among other agencies. As non-mayoral agencies, we're kind of looked at as this orphan stepchild within city government. We do have city agency status. We are funded through the city's budget, and yet there's always this sense of distrust, almost disrespect between sister agencies and community boards because we don't all report to the same boss. This is something that I'm hoping that the Charter Revision Commission will actually take a look at as a way of trying to reconnect community boards to the city's administration so that we can be more effective in the work that we do, so that we could be viewed more as insiders even though we're working for outsiders. As a district manager, I actually wasn't appointed by the mayor. I was appointed by 50 volunteer community board members who themselves were appointed by the respective borough president, half of which at the recommendation of city council members. So the community boards really don't have any direct ties to the mayor's office, which I believe is unfortunate and to some degree hobbles us in our ability to be effective as a city agency. But I do want to touch on the three different spheres of influence that community boards in their current iteration have in city government. And I'm going to quickly run through the first two and then stick on the third one for some good examples I'd like to share with you. But first, as Lou mentioned, the community boards do have a role in land use in the city of New York. We are, as it were, the first stop in the public review process. When the city wants to acquire, dispose, or change use of property, community boards have an opportunity to host public hearings and to weigh in with opinions. But community boards, as I'm constantly being reminded, are advisory only. We are not decision makers, and we have no authority whatsoever. So I've learned that community boards can be effective if they can organize their communities effectively, if they could respond with intelligent responses as opposed to emotional responses. We often have public hearings on projects, and people will come in and say it's too big, it's going to destroy the neighborhood, and these type of emotional responses we can sympathize with, but it doesn't always lend itself to good urban planning. We have to translate those kinds of emotional responses into something that fits better within a planning framework so that we can make cogent arguments about, how a project should be adapted to fit into our communities. And that's, really part of what we do as the intersection between the public and city government is often take jargon from city government and explain it to the community in a way that they understand and take feedback from the community and put it into government terms so that the bureaucrats, the planners, the administrators can take our input and actually put it to use. So, we are, as district managers, in the front line and do have to serve somewhat as universal translators. We need to speak everybody's language in order to be heard. So in land use, I think that probably the most important role of the community board, and I think that recently the City of New York revised its City Environmental Quality Review Technical Manual, which is sort of the Bible to how land use projects are reviewed. And it created a much more dynamic model because any planning is often done in a static environment, but planning as we know it is much more dynamic. It's really hard to take a plan and not consider the fact that by the time it's written and by the time it's implemented, circumstances often change, sometimes quite radically. So community boards really do help define neighborhood character. That's really the essence of what I wanted to say on land use. We're the ones that kind of decide because we're the ones who live there, we're the ones who work there, and are often, there all the time. When it comes to a battle of attrition, communities often win, but still lack the resources and the power to ultimately win the war, because communities are there all the time. So we do help define neighborhood character, and we get to say whether a manufacturing area should be changed over to a residential area. And often our agendas are sometimes at odds and sometimes complement the city's administration. So, fitting into the land use model has not been something that's been done neatly. Since we are advisory, it's not something that people often will listen to when we have something to say. It's unfortunate, and frankly, most of the land use planning that community boards do is more reactive than proactive. But thankfully, the 1989 charter revisions did change that. They created this Section 197A, which gave community boards the ability to do more proactive planning. I'm proud to say that my community board actually was the first one in Brooklyn to do a 197A plan. We did it for the neighborhood of Red Hook back in 1994, and honestly helped to redefine the neighborhood character there, take back some of the negative images that had been out in the media. And Red Hook today, if you told me in 1994 that a building in Red Hook would have sold for more than $1 million, you just would have been laughed out of town. But Red Hook is a really hot property now. Few people can actually even afford to go there.
Craig, you got to move along.
Okay, I'm sorry. Let me move this along quickly. So, in terms of budget, the second sphere of influence, community boards, I think, have the opportunity to really put forward community priorities. We do state capital and expense budget requests each year in a formal way. What I've personally experienced is that the capital requests that we submit are often listened to. It's hard to dispute when a building is falling down or when a road is in need of resurfacing. Expense requests, however, which are often programs and services, is something that we are often ignored because expense budgets are more political devices than anything else. A community can say whether if you have $1 to spend, it's more important to hire a teacher or a cop, but often, communities' voices are lost in those conversations, and the expense budget largely becomes a political tool between the city council and the mayor to work out. And the last budget, which, is the revenue budget, how much money the city tries to bring in, community and the public have absolutely no say over. There may be a public hearing or so, but there's no formal way of involving the community, and that's something that I really do hope that the Charter Revision Commission will take a closer look at. The last area, and perhaps the most, is the one of service delivery and how district managers are involved in delivering services, helping to coordinate the delivery of services in our district. Often what delivering services means at the local level is this is where we actually intersect with our local service chiefs, and we get to talk one-on-one about how we manage sometimes competing priorities and how we align sometimes competing values between an agency's policies and between a community's priorities. And that's not an easy thing to do. It often requires building relationships, building trust, and sometimes, we can be more effective at it than others because it comes down to who is sitting in the position at that time. I think 311 has proven to be an incredible management tool for the city from a central perspective. Unfortunately, since community boards don't have access to 311, we've lost capturing a great deal of information. That's something that we've been negotiating with the administration on ever since its creation, and hopefully we're making a little headway there incrementally. I would love to give a couple of examples in service delivery, but I fear that my time is being stretched, so I don't want to be unfair to my fellow panelists, and I'm happy to take any questions later on.
Come back. That's great. Mr. Jones. Here or there? Wherever you'd like.
Thanks. My interest in public affairs, city government, public policy began as a volunteer in John Lindsay's office when he was mayor. As a graduate student, I wrote my master's thesis on the police department and the Civilian Review Board and what was called the 4 platoon system, which I think you discussed yesterday, which was my first book. And then I wrote my dissertation on management reforms in the Lindsay administration and how they connected with the political reforms, which was my second book. I'm a political scientist, so I look at everything in a political context, and I don't think you can understand the Lindsay years if you don't understand the political context. A superficial look at it would tell you that the Lindsay administration was moving in 2 directions at once. There was centralization going on with the super agencies and management reforms in agencies, and there's decentralization going on. And what I found in studying it is that the two connected. In a political context which demanded better management and a city government that was more responsive to a changing community. In order to understand the larger context, you have to realize, as I'm sure you all do, I'm just reminding you, this all happened during the Great Society. And Lyndon Johnson at the time was pushing things like Community Action Program and Model Cities, which was designed to give power to communities. John Lindsay came in as an outsider. He was a liberal Republican in a city that was dominated by a Democratic Party which catered to the old established ethnic coalitions of Jews, Italians, and Irish. John Lindsay was not a friend of theirs, really. They didn't view him that way because he wasn't part of the old establishment, either in terms of partisan politics or the unions. So Lindsay wanted to connect with communities and come up with a structure that would substitute for the political clubs, which were kind of on their last legs at that point. And the idea of neighborhood city halls was one way to do that. People like Barry Goddard and Sid Davidoff, who were in that picture, were very instrumental in that. He did not invent community government. Community government has been part of the city charter from the years of consolidation. It was always a way to recognize the diverse communities of New York, which could be identified by way of race, by way of ethnicity, by way of religion, and led to an understanding that you cannot look at the city holistically only. You had to understand it in terms of a tapestry of communities that were very clearly defined. So that's the political context in which we see the Lindsay administration come in. And through the times, I think that the maturation process that took place not only led to decentralization, which was, as David had written about, was very much taken to, I would say, an extreme as far as city government went in education, where direct power was given to communities, to a backing off, both even in terms of the model cities programs and community action programs, where the mayor realized he had to take some power back from communities because of things that were being done at the community level, such as corruptions and misspending and things like that, which has not gone out of fashion. And so what we saw is a kind of a consensus around the need to both improve city management and to become more responsive to changing communities. When I looked at some of the management reforms, one of my conclusions in terms of looking at the data was this idea of doing things more efficiently and more effectively actually meant more fairly too, because one of the basic concepts in police, fire, sanitation service, which I looked at, was you allocate resources on the basis of need. So what that meant in places like the police department is more resources in high crime areas, more fire companies in areas where you had more arson. And so there was a connection between the management reforms and this overall movement towards social equity in city government. I think later on we saw even more changes in city government. The Goodman Charter kind of institutionalized a lot of the decentralization in community boards. I think later on, during the fiscal crisis, we saw even major changes in government because of the crisis situation. That's when I met people like Stan Altman and Dave Grossman, where we were working on different ideas that would say, maybe we should have one set of books, maybe the controller's idea of what the budget is should be the same as the budget directors. You know, Jim Cavanaugh was a great guy, but you can't keep the books in a box. You have to really move towards computers and integrated financial management. And major changes took place during the fiscal crisis because of the crisis atmosphere that would not have been possible during the Lindsay years. What's remarkable about the Lindsay years is so much management reform did take place, and it wasn't yet a crisis atmosphere in that sense of the word. So where are we today? As some of you know, I've spent a good part of my time working on education issues, both locally and nationally, but I've followed city government pretty closely and written extensively on the history of charter reform, and which landed me working with the current Charter Commission and Matt Goldstein. But where are we today? Where I think we are today is we are in a political context that I think deserves closer attention to management, which demands better management of resources, and I think which is actually led to a demand for more centralization than decentralization. I served as a year as an executive director on a commission of school governments a couple of years ago when the legislature was reconsidering mayoral control and whether or not it would be mayoral control of the schools and whether it be reenacted. Probably the most astounding thing that happened to me during that period of time is spending a year going around public hearings, going around to different neighborhoods in the city. One of the things that struck me, and you always learn something when you do this, and you learn something by kind of unseating some of the ideas that you had. I was really struck by how much of a consensus there was around the city for the need for centralization. And it struck me when I went into neighborhoods and people came back and who had sat on school boards and who was still very active in school politics saying, we can't go back to the old decentralized system, it didn't work. I didn't expect that to hear that from them. While there was lots of discussion and lots of argument about how mayoral control of the schools was implemented, there was a strong consensus around the city that mayoral control of the schools was important, and I see that as a marker. I see that as a kind of a very important evidence that the political culture has changed somewhat, not only in terms of those who run the city, but those who live in the city. And so that's where we are now. That being said, I think there was also a strong consensus around the city, and I just spent last summer with the Charter Commission, and we had, I think we had 15 public hearings around town in the course of the summer. That's how I spent my summer vacation. That when I wrote that paper in September, that's what the paper was about. And again, what we see is an understanding that the city needs centralized good management, but the city also has to be in tune with what's going on in communities. Not turning over power to communities the way it did during the height of school decentralization, but more on the model, which I know has made you frustrated, of advisory power, of the power of the ability of communities to articulate their wants and needs and demands and say, this is why this community is different. And when you think about an overall management strategy for the city, you have to keep in mind that Bushwick is not the same as the Upper East Side. There are very different priorities, there are very different demands. So in that sense, I think communities government is still very much alive and needs to be. Good management means being attuned to those various needs, and the only way you can do that is if you provide avenues for people in neighborhoods to communicate what they think those needs are. And that's where I think we are today. I'll stop at that.
That's perfect. Thank you, Joe. I'm going to take advantage of this as a segue. I'm going to take advantage of Herb Elish being here as well, because this is a perfect segue to some of the discussion that came up yesterday about how you put these together. I'm asking you to be a sample of one, Herb, having run one of the 2 or 3 largest city agencies with the most troops on the ground. How do we reconcile the management controls of productivity with the kind of variance and the neighborhood differences that that Joe has spoken to?
You know, I was here when all of this started in 1971, and I guess I was one of the first, what were they called? Neighborhood mayors or?
Night mayors, yeah.
Mayor out in, mayor of Jackson Heights and Elmhurst. And it was a really new experience for me out there. It was, and it was fabulous. And it was fabulous because we really came out, I think it was the first time on a regular basis, anybody from Manhattan showed up out there to talk to them about what they needed. And we were able to be responsive, you know, and we got all of the district superintendents from all the different departments, the police and the fire and sanitation people, and we were able to respond to the community, and they responded. But the way we responded to it was, we'd say, well, we'd have a meeting, there'd be 3 things that the community wanted, and I'd go back and call up the commissioners and say, you got to do this or I'll tell Lou Feldstein, you know. I mean, there was no real management system. There was no authority that was devolved in the local managers of the place. But it was effective, but I think that system, it wouldn't have had any legs. I mean, there was no management. There was nothing behind it from a management point of view. It was just commissioners who were at different levels interested or not interested in trying to get something done. You know, I was talking to Lou yesterday about how this would work. I mean, and looking at it from the vantage point of the manager of a commissioner, the central place, and somehow with experience that I've had in business or running big, you know, companies of some size and what works. Fundamentally, you know, at that time, there was no way that we could have really given authority down to the district superintendents. Not possible, because there was such uneven competence and such uneven motivation. I mean, we had district superintendents who were running their own businesses. I mean, they would use the trucks to go collect from local restaurants and charge them for it, and we had people going around catching them. And so it'd be hard to give them a lot of authority to continue that and have an influence over their price lists. I mean, that would not have really worked very well. So, and we were just then in the throes of trying to get the department under control, the stuff I was talking about yesterday. And so it was certainly premature. From a theoretical point of view, and this is extraordinarily complicated, departments, organizations like the Department of Sanitation in the city are inherently inefficient. Something that big, that diverse, it's clearly not as effective if you had several separate places really run, taking account of the local needs and also dealing with local things. There were really books written about, and I happen to subscribe to them, that any time a factory gets to be larger than 400 people, it starts to lose efficiency because you don't know all the people, you can't really deal with the problems, it's too diverse. So if you could really set up 10 sanitation departments around the city, you'd probably get better service as long as you had the right people, the right systems, right data, the right analysis, all of that, none of which existed then and none of which exists now. I mean, I would suspect in all those cases. But if you could move in that direction, a couple of things would be really good. I mean, first, you would be responsive to the customer, who is the community, more easily. Second of all, the motivation of the workers would increase to the extent that they really felt they were serving people on the block and they could, with their supervisors, make some judgments to satisfy that homeowner or that street which had been dirty becomes clean. Their pride increases rather than just being sort of dealing with faceless rules. You'll clean this street twice a week and you'll do that and not having that response. So, you know, at least my view, that would be really helpful going forward. But my sense is we're a very long way from where we are today to that. But I think to me it would be a vision that we could work for, that you could work toward to really get more and more authority devolved downward. It's just sense I had.
So
I
I
that
think
was what you expected me to say. I don't know.
I never know what to expect from you, Herb.
I don't either. No idea.
But there was so much attention, usefully yesterday, as sanitation as a model of getting a department under control, because you have to. Everyone agreed that you have to first get centralization before you can talk about decentralization. You have to get control of the agency before you can then figure out how a community could participate or make changes in it or reach it. Otherwise, there's nothing there to grab. But then, how do you reconcile the two? Most of the discussion over the day, over yesterday and even today, has been from the top down, citywide. And the question that this panel represents is, how does it come together with neighborhood variance? How do you manage to simultaneously run a big army like that and allow it to adapt itself to communities? And very hard, thank you. Well, we know that, but how do we do it? But other questions, please, and Craig and John, Joe, jump in. Jump in. Good.
Yeah, my question is
Could
for
you
my-
identify yourself each time? Please, that'd be great.
I'm Debbie Branch,
Thanks,
and
Debbie.
I run a blog called movieartreview.wordpress.com. The question is for my brother. You know, yesterday I made a big stink about my generation born between 1960 and 1967, which I think should represent, because when I went to the exhibition, you know, the paint falling down in the classroom, I was the little girl that had to sit there. So I think that my story is valid, and you should hear from me. He was a little younger, but whatever. Public land use. The community gardens, again, to the little girl with the paint falling down and blah, blah, blah. We didn't clean out those gardens that had decomposing bodies. Pimps with guns going after hoes. Syringes all over the place. We didn't clean out those gardens so Texans can cook steaks after their executive day, which is what's happening in the gardens now. Also, I got an email saying it's up for review again. You mentioned Red Hook. I remember the Hook quite well. You know, old Smith and Ninth. One way in, one way out. That's it. Now, no one's from Brooklyn in that community. If the community gardens go up again, respect the people. Why don't you build housing for these people, affordable housing, real affordable housing, for them to use? There's a big homeless crisis here in New York. You know, you're going to take that after we did you a favor. We cleaned up that mess, which attracted all your little billion-dollar buildings, Dumbo, the whole nine. Give something back to the people. How far-fetched is it that if they take a look at the public land use of the gardens, that they would build real affordable housing for people who need it?
You have to understand, one of the earlier
Okay,
points
Ralph.
that I tried to make is that community boards are not mayoral agencies. We have no power. I actually, you know what, I want to address that because the word keeps coming up about power and authority. Community boards lack authority. Authority is something that's granted. Power, however, is something that's taken. And communities can take power for themselves. And we had supported the community gardens movement when Mayor Giuliani tried to sell them off wholesale without considering the positive effects that community gardens have had in the civic life of communities. We stood up against Mayor Giuliani to defend our community gardens because they're important civic spaces. As far as what the future use of those gardens become, whether they should continue as gardens, whether they should serve another need and be repurposed for affordable housing, those are questions that go well beyond the community's ability to control. Those are questions more suited for people within the administration, people who do have the authority to make change, people who can allocate resources to them if affordable housing is the goal for that site. Frankly, you know, I would be more concerned with what the specific affected communities have to say about those gardens, whether they should continue with public civic spaces or whether they should be repurposed for affordable housing. And, you know, there is no easy answer to the issue that you raise, but I appreciate the passion with which you raised it.
How do you bring together the big city and the little city at the bottom? It is very difficult. One of the approaches that you suggested, I thought, was an addition to things that I tried to do after city government, which was information systems. You were talking about a new form of information system. I found the idea very exciting. We tried to introduce and still have, for example, in the capital budget, an information system so that community boards get the capital budget on their basis. That's why you can affect it.
Ralph, last comment.
Well, I appreciate the plug. I just wanted to say that I think I remember how I got that story. This is more of a comment than a question, and it was by going to the community boards, because I figured out early on that this was a wonderful opportunity for journalists to figure out what was going on in the city, and I got a lot of my best stories there. But my editors thought it was really boring stuff, and the copy editors particularly found it excruciating to read my stories about the community boards. But I was collecting a lot of good information, so thank you for that, and I found them very, very useful.
in a sense, this raises a kind of interesting issue, the point that Herb made and I think David made. In the 60s, the ability to do the information coordination and control wasn't really there. The technology wasn't there. The data wasn't there. I mean, we were beginning to just understand what some of this is. That's not true anymore. There's plenty of data. I mean, 311 is such a rich source of information as only one source. We have certainly the technology. We have the ability to track individual parts anywhere in the world. So the question is really whether or not there is the desire to kind of bring that technology to provide a way to kind of both decentralize and yet still coordinate the whole enterprise of the city. And I guess that is the continual struggle between political issues and kind of managerial issues. This is the conclusion of this segment of the Lindsay Years Symposium, in which we've been looking at innovations that were introduced into the operation of New York City government from 1966 through 1973. This symposium is being held at Baruch College, and I look forward to seeing you when we return for the next installment of this symposium.